and it's a great pleasure for me. One of my favorite works of literature is a short story by Kafka called Josephina the Singer, or The Mouse Folk. And now this is a story about a mouse named Josephina who can sing. And mice, that is, it's told from the point of view of the mice, and mice come from great distances to hear Josephina sing, because it's said Josephina is a complete master of the art of singing. No other mouse can sing, but only she can sing, and she's the best singer around. So people come from great distances to hear her sing. But it turns out she can't actually sing. All she can do is whistle a bit. And in fact, she not only can't sing, she can only whistle. She can't whistle any better than any other mouse. So the question is, why do the mice come from such great distances to listen to Josephina when the only thing she can do is whistle at a lower level of excellence than the level of excellence at which any other mouse can whistle? And Kafka suggests that part of the point is that precisely by virtue of Josephina standing up there and trying solemnly to do something and exhibiting to people that she does something less well than they could do themselves, and doing that in a solemn way, she gives the people involved a chance to think about what they're doing. She provides a kind of space of reflection for them. And so what I want to say is, I feel a bit in the same kind of situation with you. And that's one of the problems about politics. Bernard Williams once said to me he could never be a politician in a democratic society because that required you to say trivialities and banalities and things that everybody knew again and again and again. And so I have the sense that there won't be anything new in what I have to say to you. It'll be actually less good than what you already know. I can't provide the solemnity, but I can certainly provide the exhibition of someone trying to do something at a lower level of excellence than you can do yourself, and giving you therefore an opportunity to think about this. So this is a kind of performative act in which I want to express my solidarity with you and also give you a chance just to call to mind some of the things that you already know that I don't have to tell you about, but which it might not be useless to call to mind again. So the first thing I want to say is that there's no point whatever in thinking about the details of the government white paper, because that's a complete irrelevancy. It's important to focus on the general principles that lie behind it, and they're relatively clear. Namely, it's an attempt to destroy public institutions and the public sphere and to replace them with private institutions. And once you've understood that that is the rationale of the political process that we're engaged in, that we're observing, then talking about the details of the financing scheme is just diverting your attention from what is really important. Now, we know why the government wants to put forward a program of destroying the public sphere, particularly the public sphere in the realm of education. Partly, it's because it's, as they say nowadays, I don't actually like the term, but it's the current term, it's in the DNA of the Conservative Party that mass education and mass higher education is, to put it mildly, not a priority, and to put it a little bit more strongly, is definitely something that's dangerous. You don't want people of the wrong social class to have too much articulate ability to think about things. They might therefore have their own views about things. Universities might escape control, become places where there is a possible locus of a different kind of authority. So there's a clear rationale from the point of view of these politicians to use the current crisis, the current apparent crisis, debt crisis, to put forward another agenda. So this has nothing to do with dealing with the debt crisis. It has to do with the destruction of the public sphere, and that's the first thing to focus on. Of course, in addition, most of the politicians involved have another motivation, namely, it's not an accident that the people involved in university and education reform and in health reform are people who have a track record of close affiliation with private providers of this. So partly it's a desire to destroy the public sphere, partly it's a desire to increase the possibilities of private investment and private profit in these spheres. And that seems to me to be all one really needs to say about this. Now, in view of this, I just have two really trivial suggestions to you. The first is, don't allow the divide and conquer strategy to work. One of the strategies will be to set one group against the other, to set people in the universities against people in the schools, to set people who are health workers against people who work in the postal services, and by confronting them and dividing them to reduce resistance to these things. So please be aware that this is a strategy which, given the fact that it has a Latin term, goes back a long way, and don't fall for it. The second is, don't fall for what I might call the race to the bottom argument. That is, there's a kind of attempt on the part of the government to use the generation of envy for political purposes. What you do is you get people who are slightly better off than other people, and you cause everyone else to envy their slightly better situation so that you can pull them down a bit. Once you've pulled them down a bit, you go to the next one, take the next one, generate envy about them, and you have a kind of race to the bottom. That's another obvious strategy, and I would really hope that you'd be able to resist it. This is a single large-scale attack on public institutions, and it's only there's only any chance of resisting it if we keep together and see that the health workers, people in education, students and other people have, to some extent, the same interests in this, and if we can find some way to articulate that. Okay, now, I'd first like to say a little bit about public education and then something about free speech. A BBC reporter on a program I saw the other day asked a student who was protesting against the fares the following question. Those who go to universities will get better jobs than those who do not, so why shouldn't they pay for their own education? So this is a question the BBC reporter puts to a person who's demonstrating against the tuition raise. Now, what I want to say is, this is the wrong question. This is a trick question. This is not a question that's to be answered. This is a question that's to be dissolved. The most important thing is not to begin to think about the world as if the right way to see it is university positions are connected to good-paying jobs. This is an individual question about which particular person gets this privileged position. Therefore, we have to look at it as an individual thing and discuss it in those terms. So the question itself is a bit like the question, have you stopped torturing your children yet? No matter what answer you give to the question, have you stopped torturing your children yet, is a question that makes a certain kind of assumption, certain set of assumptions. That I have children, that I have been torturing my children, that I now think whether I should stop or not stop. So there are lots of assumptions this question makes. Giving either the answer yes or the answer no to that question is wrong. It's really important to see. Don't think about the world, I'm sorry, this is just a kind of rant, but don't think about the world just as an attempt to answer questions because somebody poses those questions. Think about the world and think about how the questions should be different. So yeah, the government will have succeeded if it gets us all to ask the question in the form, you have gone to university, you will get a good job, why shouldn't you pay for that good job? If you even begin to ask that question, you've already given the game away. Just think, for example, about the parallel question about a person who's been run over by a car. I've been run over by a car, I get medical assistance, and now why couldn't you say, well, you've got medical assistance that I didn't get, why shouldn't you pay for it? If you begin to think about it in this way, in these individualist terms, you've already lost the game. So what I want to suggest is that you think about it differently, and that instead of that question, you think about a different question. You think not about the question, given that we know that those who go to university get better jobs, why should those who get better jobs not pay to get those better jobs? Because, of course, we could imagine a society in which those who went to university didn't necessarily get better jobs, and we could also imagine a society in which that question wasn't asked. Rather, what I want to suggest is that you ask the question, what sort of society do we want to have? Do we want to have a society in which only those who are wealthy, or only those who are not debt-averse, or only those who are particularly foolhardy are capable of getting a university education? Or do we want a society in which this is differently structured? And so if you think about that question, if you think about what is true of a society, what would be true of a society in which only the wealthy, or only those who are willing to go into debt, were capable of getting a university education. No one else had access to this. If you think about that question, that's the right kind of question to ask. Not the question, why shouldn't the individual person who happens to get a university place pay for that university place? So I'd like to suggest that's the way you should think about this. Now, so we want to think then in general about how you might distribute. Suppose we assume that university place is a good. How should we distribute them then? Well, there are two existing suggestions about that. One suggestion is egalitarianism, and one suggestion is meritocracy. So one possibility is, we've got this good, we should distribute it as widely as possible. We should have an egalitarian distribution. As many people should be able to go to university as we have places. Everyone who wants to go should be given a chance to go. That's an egalitarian distribution. A meritocratic distribution, of course, is more complicated because it depends on assuming that we know what the concept of merit that's involved here is. In the case, for example, of the health services, we have some crude idea about that. You deserve to be treated by virtue of having some medical condition. And the medical condition is the ground on which we give you the splint and we don't give someone else the splint. Now, the assumption is, and it's an assumption that's deeply rooted in our society, it's not one that I want to question here, but I do want to mention that you can question it. The assumption here is that there is some parallel thing which is intellectual ability, and that it's that intellectual ability that gives an entitlement of some kind to some kind of university place. Now, regardless of whether you believe that or not, regardless of whether you believe in an egalitarian distribution or a meritocratic distribution, regardless of that, note that neither of them is the same as a distribution according to who can pay. It's not at all obvious that the people who are able to pay will be exactly those persons who, on whatever criteria of merit going to university. So no matter which kind of general rationale you prefer for distribution of university places, giving university places to those who pay or those who are willing to take on debt is not going to map that distribution ideally. Okay, now I'd like to turn a little bit to free speech. Now the first thing is, people think about free speech, it seems to me, in much, much too simplified a way. They think about it as a simple kind of yes-no question, that there's a kind of absolute ability to speak freely, and it's only impinged, and they think about it as a kind of absolute. But I want to suggest that you think about the concept both of freedom and the concept of speech in a slightly more differentiated way, and that if you think about freedom and you think about speech in such a more differentiated way, you might think about the whole phenomenon rather differently. And now this bit of the talk is a bit technical. I'm sorry about that, but anyway, I'll do it. I've already prepared it, so I'll do it there. Now, There are, as you know, the traditional distinction is that there are two concepts of liberty or freedom. This is a distinction that goes back to Isaiah Berlin in the 1960s. Isaiah Berlin said there are negative conceptions of liberty and there are positive conceptions of liberty. And now he thought that a negative conception of liberty was a conception of liberty that construed liberty merely as absence of external obstacles to action. So, for example, if I'm tied to a chair, I'm not at liberty because the rope restricts my action or impedes my action or blocks my action, and I become freed by having the rope taken off, and therefore my action is unimpeded. And that, he says, is a negative conception of liberty. Then he distinguished that from what he called positive conceptions of liberty. Now, the problem is, under the term positive conception of liberty, he put together two completely different things and submerged a third thing. So what I want to say is his division between two kinds of liberty actually needs to be understood as a distinction between four kinds of liberty. And that the first one, negative liberty, is more or less his conception. I'm free if I'm not impeded. The second one is, I'm free if I'm like a free man in a slave society and therefore not like a slave. That is, if I'm self-governing. I'm a free man in a slave society if I tell myself what to do, if no one else gives me orders, if I'm governing myself, then if I can control my passions, if I can control myself in the external world, I'm positively free. So I'm free if I'm not if I'm not tied down, and I'm free if I govern myself, if I'm recognized as a locus of autonomous action. Now, however, he says the positive conception of freedom as self-governance gets confused with a third concept of freedom, which is the concept of freedom as self-realization. And now this third concept is really important because it's the idea that, look, freedom is not just the absence of constraints. And it's also not just, as it were, being able to decide yourself, freedom of the will, being able to decide yourself what you want to do. Freedom, if it's going to be important, is going to be connected with the actual realization of something. Because why would you be interested in the concept at all? The only reason you're interested in the fact that your leg is tied to the chair is that you actually want to do something. You want to go somewhere. So the concept of freedom really is teleological. It's connected with wanting to do something. And now the third conception of freedom says, well, what do people really want to do? Well, they want to do what they really want. They want to get what they really want. So the third concept of freedom is not just that I, as it were, give myself the law of my own behavior, but that I'm capable of getting what I want. That I have a self, I have a conception of what I want, and I'm able to realize that. And that either means I'm able to act rationally, some people say, or I'm able to act in a way that realizes my authentic essence, or something like that. So that's a third conception of the concept of freedom. Now, the fourth notion of the concept of freedom is simply freedom as empowerment. That is, I'm free to the extent to which I'm actually capable, I have the power of doing something. Now, notice, that's different from the negative sense of freedom, because the negative sense of freedom is I'm free if I'm, as it were, impeded from action. Impeded from action relative to the powers that I have. The empowerment sense of freedom says I'm more free the more I'm able to do. I'm free by virtue of having power. Note that that concept of being free by virtue of having power is also not identical with the notion of self-governance. It's not the same as deciding myself what to do. I can be able to decide what to do and not have the power to do it. And similarly, I can have various powers without having the power of deciding what to do. And similarly, all of them are not the same as the concept of self-realization, because I can have the powers that I have, and I can yet fail to realize some kind of goal that I have out there. So there are really four different variations on the concept of freedom. So freedom is not one concept. There are at least four different dimensions or conceptions of it. There's lack of obstruction, there's being able to decide for yourself and give yourself your own law, there's being able to get what you want, and there's having powers to do things. And they're all slightly different. Now, Berlin had a particular ideological axe to grind, and he wanted to say something like the following thing. He wanted to collapse the second and the third concepts of freedom. He wanted to say that freedom as self-governance and freedom as realization of one's essence are really the same thing, because to govern myself, to be autonomous, is, in the final analysis, to get what I really want, and to get what I really want, to say that I'm free to the extent to which I get what I really want, leaves open the possibility that a totalitarian government could claim to be forcing me to be free. Because if you say I'm free if I get what I really want, if I really realize my essence, and if you're the government out there and you know what I really want better than I do myself, or you know what my real essence is, then the government can force you to do that even though it's forcing you against your will, and can claim you're being free. So famously, as you know, Rousseau at one point says, you have to force people to be free sometimes. And so Berlin says the second and the third concept of freedom tend to collapse, and both of them are, in fact, toxic, because both of them allow the possibility that you could be forced by someone else to be free against your will, and there's nothing worse than being forced to do something under the claim that you're actually acting freely. So that's the first step in his argument. He wants to collapse the self-governance conception of freedom and the self-realization conception of freedom. Second, and this is a terribly important thing, he wants to deny that the concept of empowerment is a concept of freedom at all, because he wants to distinguish between being free and having the conditions to realize that freedom. So he says, I might want to buy a copy of Pauli Viss. So there's this particular book I've had my lustful eye on for decades. Actually, it's, 300 volumes. It's called Pauli Viss over Realenzyklopädie der klassischen Altertumswissenschaften. Several hundred volumes. It's wonderful. Thousands and thousands of pounds. Now, Berlin would say, I'm free to buy that, because no one is prohibiting me from buying that. But I will say, well, look, the only reason I'd want to be free to buy that would be I'd want actually to buy it. But to buy it, it wouldn't be enough for me simply not to have any obstacle. I'd actually have to have the power. I'd have to have the money to buy it. So to be free to buy Pauli Vissova doesn't mean, as it were, just the government won't throw me in jail if I buy it. It has to mean something like, I have some kind of power to acquire it. Now, but Berlin says, no, that's a real mistake. That's confusing the concept of liberty with the conditions under which you can realize your liberty. Namely, the concept of liberty is that I'm unimpeded. The conditions under which I can realize them are that I have the power. And what I simply want to say is that's a typical sophistic distinction that really looks terribly clever, but actually has no political reality whatsoever. So the third part of his argument then is that the only concept of freedom is negative freedom, and that liberalism therefore is committed to the idea that negative freedom alone is the appropriate kind of freedom. Now, I simply want to reiterate what I said before, namely the remark that you find in Nietzsche, but also in other things, that the idea that the liberal's dream, negative freedom, is the only kind of freedom, Nietzsche says, is the typical dream of the slave. That is, if you really are tied up all the time, then you want nothing more than to be released from your bonds. But when you're released from your bonds, then talking about being tied up all the time and the great freedom that's involved in not being tied up all the time is irrelevant. What you're looking for is you're looking for some positive thing that you want to do. You're looking for some contentful specification. You're looking for some empowerment to get somewhere. And so it seems to me that the liberal conception that freedom can't have anything to do with positive empowerment or with positive ability to get something is simply something no one has to accept. It's simply a verbal definition which you can accept, but there isn't really any particular reason for saying that. So freedom isn't an abstract goal. We don't want freedom for itself. We want freedom because we want freedom for a particular purpose. We have something positive in mind, and we want to pursue that positive thing. And so we have to look at what that is. Now, in particular, so the concept of freedom is very complicated with all of these different ways of thinking about it. Now, when you think about freedom of speech, the whole thing becomes even more complicated because the concept of speech, too, is internally articulated. So you have at least 4 different conceptions of freedom applying to different notions of speech. So you could say, for example, there's a kind of minimal view, which is the view that freedom of speech means being able to pronounce words. That's the sort of arf conception, right? I have freedom of speech if I can say woof woof, arf, if you hit me and I'm allowed to whimper. Now, as you know, I'm often not allowed to whimper. In certain societies, if I'm beat up and I whimper, that's a really terrible thing to do. So it's not as it were useless to say that you have freedom of speech in the sense that if the police beat you up, you can whimper. That's not nothing, but it's not very much. Speech in general is not just producing sounds. It's connected on the one hand with self-expression, on the other hand with trying to get something done, persuading people, and on the third hand, as it were, with contributing something to the larger society. So there are 3 dimensions at least there. So there's one dimension which is I speak and I want to speak and I want to be free to speak because I have a need to express myself. And that's a very important part of human health, and it's of course a very important part of human health that you're not prevented from doing that, but as it were, that's a kind of minimum notion of speech, that I speak in order simply not to be able not to express myself. Second notion of speech is I'm speaking in order to get something done. I want to convince someone, I want my words to be taken seriously, I want some kind of effect. A third way of looking at speech is to look at speech not relative to an individual person producing the speech, but to look at the whole society, and to look at the society as a group of speakers, and to look at the society as constituting something like a public realm in which it's important that different opinions be expressed. So notice there are 3 different perspectives on speech. One is radically individualist, speech as an expression of myself. The other is speech as a kind of means in order to get something. And the third is speech looked at as a contribution to the richness of the public realm. And as you know, most liberals in the 19th century, John Stuart Mill, have emphasized the third of those things as particularly important. That is, they've said freedom of speech really is teleologically motivated. Because it's motivated by the idea that we've got this public realm. The public realm needs to have the widest variety of different opinions expressed in it as possible. This is usually connected with a kind of fallibilist epistemology. We don't know what's true. Since we don't know what's true, it's very important for us to have a wide variety of different opinions, etc. So the third one is this. Now note that if you think that the third of these is the really important one, if you think that freedom of speech means the richness of the public realm, then giving freedom of speech to politicians is completely pointless, right? Because then they are, by their very nature, they've contributed what they want to the public realm. You don't have to give them special protection. The argument for protection was an argument for the protection of people whose opinions might otherwise be overlooked. And so it's true, if you have someone whose opinion would otherwise be overlooked, who might be true, then there's a good argument for extending some kind of special cover to that person. But the idea that a minister in the government is a person whose opinion might be overlooked and is not adequately represented in the public realm is just ridiculous. So in particular, if you think of the public realm, I don't like to think about it this way, but if you think of the public realm in the way a lot of liberals do, as a competitive place where there are different opinions jostling for power, then, of course, if we run a race, we don't race a 3-year-old boy against a 16-year-old boy and think that's a really fair race. If we want to intervene, we intervene either by giving the 3-year-old boy a motor scooter or by forcing the person who's 16 to carry a large burden. We give him a handicap of some kind. So if this model, this liberal model of the realm of ideas as a really important realm in which there are opinions, and it's important to get a wide variety of opinions, that's right. The more correct that is, the more unimportant it is that people in the audience do not interrupt politicians. Politicians have newspapers, they have other ways. Their opinions are there in the public realm. We don't need protection for that. We need protection for something else. So I merely want to say then that freedom of speech, it's very important not to confuse freedom of speech with freedom of propaganda, and not to confuse freedom of propaganda with freedom to control the agenda. That is, it's one thing to say anyone can, in fact, have an opinion. It's another to say anyone can express that opinion. It's a third thing to say anyone can express that opinion in public. As you know, in lots of countries, there's a very strong distinction between the freedom of opinion and speech you have and freedom of the propagation of those opinions. When I was growing up in the 60s, in France, for example, if you were a conscientious objector against military service, you would not be drafted into the French army. But you would be imprisoned if you publicly propagated conscientious resistance. And that's not an incoherent thought. It's perfectly reasonable to say there's a difference between my allowing people to speak in private, to have their opinions, and my allowing them to speak in public. So freedom of speech in private, freedom of speech in public, freedom of speech in public in certain contexts, freedom to publish things, freedom to speak authoritatively without being interrupted, and freedom to speak as part of a huge theatrical performance. After all, the appearance of the minister here was not part of public discussion. It was part of a huge theatrical performance which he had installed in order to make a particular kind of political point. And as you know, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say I wasn't here, but I mean, if you had all sat there and listened politely, and even if you had raised objections, even if you had raised devastating objections, you would have been following the script and participating in the performance. Now, to my great surprise, my great pleasure, you didn't follow the script. So you didn't participate in his political performance, which was part of his curricula vitae of showing his open-mindedness. But notice, so what I'm trying to say is all of those distinctions are appropriate. What you say in private, what you say in public, what you propagate, what you say authoritatively, what you say in the context of an official invitation, what you say in the context of definitively setting down the law for people. All of those are different, and all of those might stand in a different relation to the notion of freedom of speech. So freedom of speech has to be context-specific, and if it's context-specific, then the context in which you, as normal members of the public, speak and a minister speaks is not a context in which there is a structural impartiality or equality involved, and that should be taken account of probably too. Now, note further, if you accept the neoliberal view that the government preaches, then Willits is our servant, our hired man. We pay his salary, after all. Here, boy. If you drop that, and you think about this more in terms of traditional democratic theory, then he's not our servant or hired man, he's a representative. But in both cases, you might think that a democratic politician who is stopped from speaking by members of the public is always wrong, That is, he's supposed to be listening to us. He's not supposed to be preaching to us. Whether he's our hired representative or he's our representative in some other sense, he's not supposed, as it were, to be laying down the law to us. He's supposed to be listening. You remember, those of you who have read Plato's one of Plato's dialogue, Plato says, there was a man who claimed he could teach virtue, and one of his students took him to court. And Plato says, the student who took his teacher of virtue to court had to be right, because either the teacher had taught him virtue, in which case the student was right, or the teacher hadn't taught him virtue, in which case he was also wrong. So in both cases, if the student takes the teacher to court, the student is right and the teacher is wrong. And I want to suggest that the default position here, of course we have to take these things context specific, but the default position here should not be that when the minister talks to people and is interrupted, the minister is right and the people interrupting is wrong. The default position should be the other way around. Now, to say it's the default position is not to say that in every single case it will be correct. But of course, you can't say what's going to be true in every single case. Okay, so if you think, as I do, that the present government policy is a death warrant for higher education in the UK, and that the destruction of the higher education system isn't just a bad thing, but it's a true catastrophe, then I think you might think, as I do, that one would be acting irresponsibly if one didn't make something of a fuss about this. So I'm sorry, that's all I've prepared to say. Yeah, sure. Yeah, if people have something to say, I'm happy. I mean, I can't say I'll answer. I can answer them, but I'm sorry this was just so performative. But as I said, the arguments are so clear. There isn't any. And obviously, if you think that there isn't enough money for universities, I merely point out that last year the bonuses given out by the City of London, not the salaries. The bonuses were 6 or 7 billion pounds, and that is just about equivalent to the teaching grant of the universities. I also would remind you that Vodafone and other places and other companies have significant tax arrears which have not been collected or for which they've been granted grace by the government. I'd also like to point out that the 2 aircraft carriers that are being built the first one is going to be built and immediately put into mothballs. Now that's very useful. And the second one is going to be built with no aircraft. That's really useful too. And they're going to cost, I think, the present estimate is 4 billion pounds. But let's see the bill when that finally comes in. So if people say there isn't money to continue the present educational system, in politics, to say there isn't money for X, or we cannot do X, or it's impossible, is always a potentially ideologically loaded thing. We can't doesn't generally mean we can't. It generally means, sometimes rightly, we won't. We don't think that's a good use of this money. But the idea that we absolutely don't have money for this is, I'm unconvinced by that claim. That just seems to be clearly false. We'd prefer to have 2 mothballed aircraft carriers and to let the people who run the banks in London have their 7 billion pounds, in addition to their salaries, of course, than to continue the present education system. And I would like to see, I don't even know how much the Olympic Games are going to cost, but I suspect that I'm sorry to say it because I like this country a lot. I do love it, but it's a very bad sign when a country begins to spend money on empty prestige projects while taking it from things that really matter. It's a really bad sign. It's complete decadence when you're trying to take money from the National Health Service, the education system, and what you're doing with it is not something. It's one thing if the Second World War and the Nazis have tanks on the Channel. It's another thing if you're taking that money and you're building mothballed aircraft carriers, you're building large pharaonic temples to sport on waste areas in East London, or you're giving it to bankers. That just strikes me as a very, very, very depressing. It's very depressing that it's depressing that anyone suggested it, but it's even more depressing that there isn't more of an uproar about it. I mean, it's really outrageous. Sorry, I'm just ranting.